All right, so it's 10 a.m. We're going to get going here. Thank you all for joining us for today's live webinar, The Path to Inclusion. We're very excited to have you with us. Several of you, I think, were with us in last webinar where we went through the 4 stages. Today, we're going to go through the 4 stages of psychological safety and focus particularly on inclusion. And leading today's webinar, we have with us Dr. Timothy R. Clark, the author of the 4 stages of psychological safety, which was released earlier this year, and CEO of Leader Factor. So Tim, we're very happy to have you with us. And with that, I'll turn it over to you to get us going.
Fantastic. Thanks, Junior. Hi, everybody. Can you see me and hear me? Okay. Am I coming through? Thank you for joining us. And I want to just say at the outset that we'd really like to have a very interactive experience. And so please use your chat box, and then we're going to do Q&A at the end of the presentation. We'll have some time for that. So as Junior said, we're going to do a deeper dive on inclusion in particular today. So let's jump in. We have an agenda, five-part agenda. We're going to talk about inclusion and the culturally flat organization. What does that mean? Threat detection and fear. Then we're going to overview the 4 stages of psychological safety for context. And then we're going to do a deep dive into stage 1, which is inclusion safety. And then finally, we're going to talk about concrete steps to create a deeply inclusive culture, wherever you may be, whatever organization you may be in. So that's the agenda for today. Let's begin with inclusion and the culturally flat organization. I want to begin with a question for you. And so let's see, Junior, do we want to use Q&A or chat box on this?
Let's go ahead and do Q&A.
Q&A. Okay, so pull out your Q&A. What does it mean to create a culturally flat organization? Now, whether that's new terminology to you or not, let me just throw out that question. What does that imply in your minds? To be culturally flat. Now, think about that and put your responses in Q&A. And as you're doing that, let me just say that if you have a large, complex organization, then there has to be hierarchy. There have to be roles and responsibilities. There has to be a division of labor, right? This is how we organize and organize work and we execute. So these are some net necessities in organizational elements that we have to have. But the culture doesn't have to be hierarchical, does it? And that's what we're talking about. So culturally flat. So let me share some of your responses. So it means equal, a network of teams, non-hierarchical, homogeneous. The hierarchy is not valued. Hierarchy is less of a focus in the performance of the organization overall. That's good. I like that. A decrease in middle management. Everyone is the same with backgrounds and perspectives. My behavior is not dependent on the organizational level of the person I'm interacting with. Okay, this is true. So the danger in organizations is the homogenization of thought. Now, I want you to think about that. When we start thinking alike, when we create an echo chamber, right, when we become yes men and women, that benefits no one, because we need intellectual friction in any organization in order to be successful. But becoming culturally flat is a great challenge. And that is part of the discussion on inclusion that we're going to have today. Culturally flat means that you become agnostic to the hierarchy when it comes to debating issues, because you debate issues on their merits. And no one pushes the fear button, right? So we're going to talk more about this. How do we become culturally flat? Now let me show you what we call the inclusion continuum. So here it is. This is the inclusion continuum. Now, I want you to think about how organizations approach inclusion systematically in their organizations. So how do we do this? Right? So traditionally, we go left to right on the inclusion continuum. We begin with awareness. So the initial awareness of differences, and then we progress to understanding. So this is the next step in the inclusion continuum. And then we move to appreciation. So that's the third step. So the traditional approach to inclusion is we go left to right on the inclusion continuum. And then we hope and pray in most instances that we can cross what we call the threshold of conviction and move to belief and behavior. So on the other side of this threshold of conviction is belief and behavior. This is the traditional approach. So how's this working for us? Is it wrong? It's not wrong. So I want you to think about this for a minute. Okay? It's not wrong, it's just not sufficient. And I want you to think about this. And so the most successful organizations in the world that we're working with as it relates to using the continuum is they're coming at it from the left side of the continuum and the right side of the continuum. They're coming at it from both sides, not just awareness to understanding to appreciation, hoping that we can cross over the threshold of conviction and then get it into our hearts, right? And then begin to behave inclusively when we finally get into behavior. And then we solidify it into the prevailing norms of the organization. The most successful organizations that we're working with now, as I said, they come at it from both angles. They begin with awareness, but they also begin with behavior. Now, how do you do that? You assign people to projects and work and collaboration where they actually start collaborating, even though they may not have the belief that undergirds that behavior. And so the principle is to behave, to behave until you believe. The behavior generates confirming evidence that diversity and inclusion is not only the right thing, but from a competitive standpoint, there's a massive return on investment. Most people can't get there if they start with awareness to understanding to appreciation. We bring a lot of resentment by the time we get to the threshold of conviction. So I want you to ask yourself, are you coming at this from both angles, from both ends of the spectrum? Just think about that. Reflect on that a little bit, okay? So let's talk about diversity and inclusion and what the differences are. Diversity is compositional. Diversity is a fact in all teams if it's nothing but cognitive diversity. If all other things are equal, if there's homogeneity in all other demographics, there certainly won't be homogeneity in psychographics and in people's cognitive processes. So diversity is a choice, it's compositional. Inclusion, on the other hand, is very, very different. It's moral and ethical, it's attitudinal, and it's behavioral. And it is a choice. So diversity, we're making great gains on the diversity side of the equation, but many organizations are bumping up against limits because they've altered the composition of the organization in terms of diversity. They've made great strides. But as they're moving into inclusion, they're getting stuck and their progress has slowed to a crawl. Okay, so let's talk about this. I'm gonna put out a polling question that I'd like you to answer. All right, so let's launch this polling question real quick. Here it is. Where do you focus your efforts to create a more inclusive environment? Do you start at awareness, understanding, appreciation, belief, or behavior? So I'm going back to the continuum, right? But let's see where you are, because I think you're going to learn from each other that we are still struggling with this mightily across organizations. Okay, are you there? Answer the polling question. Okay, you're still coming in. Okay, good, good. You'll find this fascinating. We have a big enough sample size today that it's statistically projectable with a rather high margin of error, but still these are good data that we're generating. All right. Give you just a few more seconds. Okay, now let me show you this. You'll find this absolutely fascinating. Share results. Here we go. Take a look at the results. So 32% of you are saying that you approach your efforts with awareness, 19% with understanding, 14% with appreciation, 7% with belief, and 28% with behavior. Isn't this fascinating, the distribution? It shows us that this is a very big challenge. And there's no single way to do it. But as I've said before, if you can come at it from both sides of the continuum, chances are you're going to have more success. You've got to come at it from both sides of the continuum. Okay, so hopefully that's helpful to you. There's some insight there. Okay, fantastic. All right, I'm going to ask you one more question right now. Are you ready? Okay, I'm going to launch this poll. What kind of progress are you making to create a more inclusive environment? Are you sprinting? Are you running? Are you jogging? Are you walking? Or are you crawling? Right? So that's the way that we like to conceptualize progress. So it's metaphorical, but where are you? How would you assess your institutional progress when it comes to creating a more inclusive environment? How would you rate that? Give you a few more seconds and then I'll share the results with you. Okay. Your results are confirming the other empirical research that we have, right? And that I'm sure you're aware of. Okay, let me end the polling and let me share the results with you. So take a look. Only 2% of you say, "Oh, we're sprinting. We're making just rapid progress." 7% you're running, 22% you're jogging, 47% you're walking, and 23% you're crawling. So between those that are walking and crawling, right, we are at 70%. 70%. This is a long, hard slog. We're making great progress, but we've got a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do. All right, let's carry on. So hopefully that's helpful as a benchmark, as a baseline to understand the nature of the challenge. Now let's talk about current context, because in this pandemic, we have a once in a lifetime opportunity. Let me explain that. So there's an opportunity in the calamity of the COVID-19 pandemic. And here's what it is. We know based on the research for large-scale organizational change that a crisis has a very special quality. It has the ability to liquefy the status quo. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, it has the ability to turn the status quo into a fluid form. That therein lies the opportunity for all of us to accelerate the transformation of organizational culture, because the prevailing norms are in a state of flux, right? They have been knocked out of their equilibrium. And that's what we all need to understand. This is something that I studied very deeply at Oxford in graduate school. So given that, and given the context of this pandemic, The question is, will you hibernate or accelerate through the crisis? Because this opportunity is in our laps right now. So let me explain a little bit more. Organizations develop a status quo, the way we do things, our norms, and those norms become fossilized. This is the word that we use in the research literature. So the status quo becomes very hard. It becomes calcified. And when we attempt to change it, we normally make incremental changes, especially in cultural transformation, because culture is the single most difficult thing to change in an organization. So in many organizations, we have normalized exclusive and disrespectful behavior, both subtle and overt. And so what I'm sharing with you right now is that we have a once in a lifetime opportunity to dislodge these entrenched norms because of the pandemic that we're in. So despite the great adversity that we face and the great dislocation that we face, there's an incredible opportunity that we face as well. And that is this liquefied status quo. So now we have the opportunity to be very deliberate in designing the future state while the current state is in flux. We've already left the current state. We're in transition. The question is, will we go to the future state by default, or will we go to the future state by design? And that's the question that we all face right now. And so my suggestion is that we do it by design and that we are very deliberate given the opportunity that we have. Okay, number 2, threat detection and fear response. Let's talk about this. Whenever humans go into a social setting, they engage subconsciously in what we call fear detection, and threat detection. So what's going on around me? And they start to perceive the interpersonal environment. Now, let me ask you some questions. And these are questions that I'm sure you can relate to on one level or another. Have you ever felt excluded in a social setting? Have you ever been afraid to ask a question? Have you ever remained silent when you knew the answer to a problem? Have you ever had someone steal credit for something you did? Have you ever been ignored in a discussion? Have you ever been rudely interrupted in a meeting? Have you ever felt that you were the target of a negative stereotype? Have you ever faced retaliation for challenging the status quo? Have you ever had a boss who asked for feedback but didn't really want it? Have you ever been publicly shamed or made fun of? Have you ever been punished for making an honest mistake? And finally, have you ever been made to feel inferior? That ever happened to you? Welcome to the human family. It's happened to all of us. But now we're finally, based on mounting empirical research, we're finally able to understand the ramifications, the organizational ramifications of these kinds of events. Here's what we know. These events activate the pain centers of the brain and trigger the self-censoring instinct. We all have a self-censoring instinct. Let's talk about how that works. Let me graphically portray this. So again, let's get a continuum that ranges from fear at one end to psychological safety at the other. And here's what happens. So at some point, as we lose psychological safety and we move into the realm of fear, it triggers what we call the self-censoring instinct, and all humans have one. When someone or something activates that self-censoring instinct, what do? We retreat, we recoil, and we manage personal risk. We go into a mode of self-preservation, right? We have to, and personal risk management. But what we really haven't understood quite so well in years past is the implications of this. So let's talk about what it does. Exclusion and any of these events that are exclusion-based events, they induce fear, and fear changes behavior. Once the self-censoring instinct is activated, it moves a person, it thrusts a person into a defensive posture. And so their preoccupation is, as I said, self-preservation. So they're siphoning off a portion of productive capacity and creative output, and they're wasting it on trying to protect themselves. And that's what happens in organizations. And so if this becomes institutional, if this becomes systemic, if this becomes chronic, you can see that the cost, the tax imposed on the organization is profound. It actually brings productivity and collaboration, it brings it way down. So here's what we know. Fear-stricken employees, they give you their hands, some of their head, and none of their heart. You don't get their heart. You get their hands, but they're going to be working out of compliance and not commitment. You're going to get some of their cognitive capacity, but you're not going to get all of it. You're going to get a portion, and you're probably not going to get any of their heart, which regulates their discretionary efforts. So you're going to get compliance-based performance, and that's not very competitive in 2020. All right, let's do a quick overview of the 4 stages of psychological safety so that we can then have context to go back to inclusion. Psychological safety itself is a concept that was coined in 1965 by 2 researchers at MIT, Warren Bennis and Edgar Schein. And they published the first known reference to the term in 1965 in a book called Organizational and Individual Change Through Group Methods, 1965. Since then, the concept kind of lay fallow for many years, and then some other researchers picked it up. And in the last 2 years, as you may know, the research has exploded, and we now have very, very solid empirical research or data to help us understand that psychological safety is really the valve that turns on the engagement and the discretionary efforts of people. In the most basic sense, it means that it's not expensive to be yourself. And when I say expensive, I mean socially, I mean politically, I mean economically, I mean emotionally. It's not expensive. And so when it's not expensive, what do people do? They are themselves. When it is expensive, they change their behavior. That's what happens. So now let me give you a fuller definition for psychological safety. Psychological safety means you can do 4 things. Number 1, you feel included. This is where inclusion comes in, and this is where we're going to do a deeper dive here in a minute. So the foundation is to feel included. That's number 1. We long to belong. Number 2, you feel safe to learn. Number 3, you feel safe to contribute, make a difference. And number 4, you feel safe to challenge the status quo. And you can do all of these things, these 4 things, without fear of being embarrassed or marginalized or punished in some way. So let me show you the progression. So we're going to put this in the context of a chart with 2 dimensions. So psychological safety is a function of respect and permission. It's based on that intersection, that fusion. So as I said before, let me get out my my highlighter. Let's see, highlighter. Here we go. Stage 1, inclusion safety. So this is the foundation. This is where we begin, and this is really the focus of the webinar today. If you don't establish inclusion safety as the foundation, you don't pass go. And you really can't advance because the vulnerability and personal risk required to perform in the other stages is even higher. And so there's a natural progression based on human need. The second stage is learner safety, as I said. Learner safety means that you can engage in all aspects of the discovery process, learning without being embarrassed or marginalized or punished. So you can ask questions, you can give and receive feedback, you can experiment, you can make mistakes, and it's going to be all right because the organization is protecting you in your learning risk. And so therefore you're going to do it again. Now, let me give you a statistic that I mentioned in the book. Every 26 seconds, a student in the United States drops out of high school, out every 26 seconds. It's unbelievable. Why is this happening? Is it because they don't have the cognitive bandwidth to do the work? In almost every case, no. Barring some legitimate learning disability, they can do the work. But what we know about learning is that learning is both an intellectual and an emotional process. Those two tracks are interwoven. And so when a student becomes emotionally bruised, that affects their ability to learn because the emotional track is interwoven with the intellectual track. So when they don't feel the support, when they get discouraged, when they're emotionally bruised, at some point they call it quits. And that's what happens. So that's learner safety. Learner safety then leads to contributor safety as stage 3. Contributor safety means that you feel free and able to contribute as a full member of the team to make a difference, to use what you have learned, right? The previous stage was to learn. Now we're going to apply what we've learned. And we want to make a difference. Humans have a great, innate, intrinsic need to use what they've learned, their skills, their abilities, their talents, their knowledge, to make a difference. They need autonomy, they need direction, they need encouragement. That's stage 3. Then we go to stage 4. Stage 4 is the culminating stage. We call it challenger safety. Challenger safety means that you feel safe to challenge the status quo without fear of jeopardizing your personal standing or reputation. This is where we innovate. So I want you to think about now the connections and ultimately how we're connecting to innovation. It is in this realm that you are given a license to innovate. If you think about innovation, innovation by its very nature is disruptive of the status quo. It requires creative abrasion. It requires constructive dissent. It requires that we have ideas collide and rub against each other. We need hard-hitting debate and dialogue. And so the social exchange, by the time you get all the way to challenger safety, the social exchange is that I will give you candor in exchange for air cover. I have to be protected in my ability to provide candor, to challenge the status quo. If we can't have that exchange of candor for cover, then I'm out. Why? Because my personal exposure, my personal vulnerability, my personal risk, it's too high. And so I'm going to drop out and I will be neutral. So if the challenger safety isn't there, then I am neutralized as a participant in that innovation process. So this is the natural progression. Now let's come back to it. All begins with a foundation of inclusion safety. So if you ever wondered whether inclusion safety was really that important in execution, let alone innovation, that argument has been settled. There is absolutely no question. And the empirical data that we have coming in is indisputable at this point. So this is just a basic overview of the stages and how they work. Okay, so let's do the deeper dive into inclusion safety, which is, as I said, stage one. Think about, when have you ever felt excluded? What did that do to you? Did it activate the pain centers of the brain? Did it neutralize your performance? Did it thrust you into a defensive posture? These are the things that happen. Now let's talk about this, because this is so vital for institutions. Inclusion safety is a human right. If you are human and harmless, then I am morally obligated to include you. So the right to inclusion is not earned, it is owed. And this is based on the principle that worth precedes worthiness. The intrinsic worth of human beings is such that they are owed inclusion. They just need to be human and harmless. And then we are obligated to invite each other into our respective societies. There's no way that we can justify arbitrary distinctions that would create exclusion. Can't do it. So what's happening now in organizations, and this is a beautiful thing, is that as millennials are pouring into the workforce, the moral ethical force that is being exerted on organizations to create inclusive organizations is unprecedented. It's absolutely unprecedented. Why? Because the millennials come in and they expect inclusion safety as a term of employment, as a matter of course. They expect it. And if it's not there, then initially the first thing that happens is you will bleed out your top talent. You're going to bleed them out because they simply are not going to buy into that kind of employee-employer compact. That's just not on the table for them. And this is what we're seeing with organizations around the world, across cultural fault lines, across demographics, across nations. We're seeing this as a juggernaut. And this is a wonderful thing, because we are seeing significant progress here. So what do we traditionally do? Humans tend to govern themselves based on what we call junk theories of superiority. Well, what is a junk theory? A junk theory is a theory that's just not true. It's false. It's specious. And this is what we have been doing. This is how humans have governed their societies for millennia. So it's not anything new. What is new is that we're coming to terms with this as never before. We're being more self-reflective. We're being more honest than we've been, and we are laying bare the bias and the prejudice and the junk theories that we use, the soothing stories that we tell ourselves to justify the way that we are governing and interacting with each other. So let's talk about what we call the myth of superiority. So I want you to think about this in all of the social collectives that you may participate in, not just at work, but it could be at school, it could be a civic organization, it could be at home. The myth of superiority is perpetuated based on many, many factors, right? And we've all used some of these factors in one way or another in an inappropriate way. We all have. And we've also had these used on us in inappropriate ways. So take a look here. So I'm socially superior or inferior. Ever felt that way? I'm physically superior or inferior. I'm intellectually, ethnically, in terms of gender, ideologically, politically, racially, morally, ancestrally, based on heritage, religious, educational, performance, geographic. We were talking to, we had a session yesterday with several women, and they were talking about the cultural fault line between different parts of the United States and how they had felt that. And they had felt very overt forms of exclusion based on that. It was kind of shocking to think that those things linger, but they do, right? Economically, generationally, you know, I'm a member of a superior generation. Occupationally, right? I remember we've worked with a lot of research hospitals and institutions around the world. And you go in, and on the clinical side, you've got the cardiothoracic surgeons and the neurosurgeons that are at the top of this pecking order, and they behave accordingly. It's rubbish, right? That all needs to be, we need to neutralize that, right? Do you see how this works? We should be agnostic to rank in that sense. Associational, tribal, age, familial. And this is not an exhaustive list. So the myth of superiority penetrates organizations and is perpetuated by whom more than anyone else? Well, it's leadership, but then we all participate in one way or another. So our levels of self-awareness and perception and observation, they have to go to a completely different level, because some of this is, as you know, it's overt, some of it's hidden, and we often have, and we all have blind spots as well, but we've got to go to a different level in our ability to perceive and then unlearn. Let's keep going. Why do we seek superiority? Why does the myth of superiority continue to plague us? Because of the universal condition that we are insecure. And so we see people trying to compensate for that insecurity in myriad ways. We see it all the time. And we invoke superiority. We make claims of superiority based on all of those criteria and factors that we just went over. They're all junk theories. It's all junk. It's all false. But we're having a hard time purging the organization of these because we have the vestiges from the past, and then we are deeply socialized and acculturated with these patterns. So it's hard to dislodge. Okay, let's go to concrete steps to create a deeply inclusive culture. And I wish we had a lot more time. So what we're going to do, and by the way, let me just say, at about 45 after the hour, we'll do some Q&A. I wish we had a lot more time, but hopefully we're touching a few primary points that you'll find important and actionable. So concrete steps, let me give you a few. Number one, conduct a personal inventory. And when I say a personal inventory, I mean a fearless, searching, penetrating personal inventory. And then a trusted advisor interview. Find a trusted advisor that you can sit down with to then identify and help you shed your own bias, negative bias. Humans are dripping with bias. This is the way that we are. This is the way that we make sense of reality. And it's also a way that we create cognitive shortcuts so that we can process the world. But we all have trace elements of negative bias that we need to get rid of. And this is a very wonderful and liberating process to go through. So that's number one. And you can set people up in peer coaching relationships in an organizational setting to do this. And it is incredible, the power that can come with just step one. Number two, Identify and stop perpetuating junk theories of superiority. Do an institutional review to try to locate where you have institutional bias or you're perpetuating junk theories of superiority, right? Because what we're trying to do is neutralize the impact of rank. We're trying to become agnostic to title, position, and authority so that people are uninhibited as they debate issues on their merits in an organization, so that we can accelerate learning, we can accelerate the velocity of information in the organization, we can increase the adaptive capacity of the organization. So we really have to look very carefully to see where we're perpetuating the junk theories. Number 3, this is behavioral. Pay attention to these 3 verbs: ask, invite, and share. These are actionable words. And if we adopt these 3 words in our behavioral patterns when we're interacting, it immediately begins to shift the prevailing norms of the organization, right? So just keep those 3 in mind. And I won't go more into it because you'll find that it starts to work immediately. Ask, invite, and share. What that does is it immediately begins to create inclusion safety and build the foundation. Number 4, create opportunities to behave until you believe. Remember the inclusion continuum. You can start at awareness, and that's fine. Please keep doing that. But if you're not, start at the other end as well, at the behavioral end, because the behavior generates confirming evidence that inclusion is a true principle and that it is a human right. So that's number 4. Number 5, in terms of additional resources, practical resources to help you, use the behavioral guide, which Junior will give you access to at the end of the webinar, and then the team survey to get a baseline on where your team is based on the 4 stages of psychological safety. It is what we have found is that many leaders, we ask them, so how you doing on inclusion? How would you rate your team for inclusiveness in terms of an inclusive culture on a 10-point scale? And what we find over and over again is that they are very wrong. Their guess is very wrong compared to the reality when the team is surveyed. So keep that in mind. You need an accurate baseline to begin from, okay? So I'll come back. Behave until you believe. Begin at the behavioral end, keep going on the awareness end, cross the threshold of conviction, and accelerate your efforts as you do. Now, let me just say a word to leaders, because leaders have what we call 2 primary levers. The leader's most powerful lever is his or her own modeling behavior. The number 2 lever is the coaching skills which the leader possesses. Everything else in leadership is what we call scaffolding. It's all support. But these are the 2 levers that leaders that exert the greatest influence. So as we know, based on many studies, the best synonym for leadership in the English language is the word influence. So then you think about, how do you influence? Number 1, modeling behavior. Number 2, coaching skills. So keep that in mind, because you cannot make significant progress if you're not focusing on these 2 levers in terms of shifting the culture and creating a more deeply inclusive environment. Here's my final thought, and then we'll go to Q&A. Be the cultural architect of your workplace. Here's the pattern. Here's the cascade of culture formation. Number one, a pattern of thought or behavior in a person is a habit. A pattern of thought or behavior in a team is a norm. A collection of norms in an organization is a culture. That's how it works. And that's why we begin with modeling behavior. We create habits. Habits then spill out and become norms. They solidify and we become a culture. So let me go back to what I said earlier. There's a once in a lifetime opportunity in the context of this pandemic to significantly shift your organization to become more deeply inclusive. You are now working in a state of disequilibrium with your organizations. Be deliberate and in defining your future state, and don't let the opportunity go to default. So that is something that I hope that you will really think about and put some time and resource and energy into, because you do have that opportunity. Okay, that's a lot. It's 46 after, but we're 1 minute over scheduled time. Let's do some Q&A.
All right, everybody. So in the Q&A box, go ahead and submit your questions. We definitely will not be able to get to all of them, but we'll pick out a few. So go ahead and throw those in there.
Okay, so here's the first question that I'd like to address. Someone says, behave until you believe reminds me of fake it till you make it. And there's a potential danger there. What do you think? Yes, let me make the distinction. To behave until you believe, it's all about intent. And so this goes back to, for example, the pioneering work of Dr. Hochschild at Berkeley, who talks about surface acting. Any job requires emotional labor. If you try to manufacture that emotional labor and you don't have the right intent, if it's not in your heart, that is what we call surface acting. You're trying to produce the emotions, but you don't feel it. Normally, the reason you don't feel it is because your intent is not right. So you have to begin with the right intent. Now, you can't ever force anyone to do that, but that's the difference. So we behave until we believe with pure intent, with no ulterior motive. That's what we want. Now, there's no guarantee that people will always do that, but that's the invitation. And what we have found is that it does make people make tremendous progress when they put a good faith effort into what they're doing. Okay. Okay. Okay, here's another this is a good point. Would it be better to invert our focus in inclusion and diversity versus diversity and inclusion? Right, so let's switch the sequence, let's switch the order. Seems like too much focus is on overt physical diversity and inclusion for all, and inclusion oddly gets excluded. There's a lot of truth to what you're saying. Unfortunately, in many organizations, we've made great gains with diversity, and then we congratulate ourselves, and yet, guess what? The culture is not inclusive. We're still struggling with the same problems, but we've altered the composition of the workforce. So what did we really accomplish? The job's not done. So I really appreciate your point, because it underscores the point that we've got work to do. We need far more emphasis on the inclusion side, because these come together. And so you can't you can't get half the job done. You could be just as dysfunctional as ever if there's a kind of an exclusive focus on diversity. So that's a really, really good point. Okay. What can we do when we realize that we accidentally or unknowingly push the fear button on someone? That's a great question. And I don't have I don't have an easy answer to that. My answer to that is that we have to be very forthcoming, and we have to apologize, and we have to acknowledge that we were less than we could have been, and that our behavior was not really aligned with our values. We make mistakes, and I just think that we have to own that. We have to take accountability. We have to take responsibility for our behavior when we make a mistake like that. And I do think that people are forgiving when we do that. They're much more forgiving. But as soon as we acknowledge it, sometimes we say something or we do something, and in that instant, we know it was the wrong thing, or we know we could have done it better. It was a sin of omission or commission, whatever it was. I think we have to own it quickly and acknowledge it. So let me give you a tool here. So there are three forms of deflection that humans use when they don't want to take ownership for their behavior. Number one, denial. Number two, blame. Number three, excuse. The more self-aware we become, the more we see those patterns in ourselves. And the more we're able to stop or check ourselves when we start to go down one of those three roads, right? Denial, blame, or excuse. And so when we can acknowledge that, especially if you're in a leadership position, do you know how empowering that is when leaders are honest about those things and they acknowledge their shortcomings, but they hold themselves accountable? Inclusion and creating an inclusive environment ultimately cannot be legislated. And it's not something that we can extract through compliance. Ultimately, it is that we are holding ourselves accountable to the unenforceable. That's how we get to inclusion, because it has to get into your heart, right? Hands isn't enough. Head isn't enough. It's got to go all the way. That's how you do it. Okay, let's see what else. We got so many here. Okay, here's a tough question. I don't know if I should take it because it's tough, but let's try it anyway. How do employees, I'm reading the question, by the way. How do employees who feel psychologically unsafe in an organization start to build the resilience and build their resilience and safety? What if the leader has a blind spot, right? Okay. So first of all, you have to assess the environment, right? You're doing threat detection and fear response. So how unsafe is it? Are you getting to a toxic realm? If you're getting to a toxic realm, it gets difficult to manage risk, because normally in a toxic realm, it's a punitive environment. The truth is not rewarded. The truth is punished. Now, one of the principles that I articulate in the book is that if you go into any organization, the prevalence of fear is the first sign of weak leadership. So I want you to think about that. The prevalence of fear is the first sign of weak leadership. So if there's a lot of fear, it is true that is positively correlated with personal danger, because the truth is likely to be punished and not rewarded. So you're going to have to make a risk reward calculation that only you can do to see if you feel willing and able to challenge the status quo to see if you can make it better. Now, no one could ever tell you in context what you should do. There are times when we need to be courageous and it makes sense, and we do challenge the status quo, and we are punished for it. And you've probably felt that way before. I have. So there's no algorithm for this. There's no formula for this. This is a matter of judgment. So what I would do is I would spend time, first of all, as a cultural anthropologist, to understand the norms and pay attention to what we call acts of vulnerability. When someone asks a question, when someone makes a suggestion, when someone offers an alternative point of view, pay attention to the response patterns to those acts of vulnerability. That's what you got to pay attention to, because that will help you decide whether you're going to commit your own act of vulnerability to try to help. So that's what I would say. And then also, to help yourself, make sure that you are acting with superb emotional intelligence. If you don't, then you make yourself the object of the attention, the negative attention, and you become the problem, even though the real problem, the systemic problem, the chronic problem, is perhaps in leadership or in the organization. But you've shifted the focus to you because of your poor performance and your bad behavior. So don't make that mistake, but that's so difficult. And I know that I know how difficult that is, because you may be on the receiving end of belittling, disrespectful, demeaning, marginalizing behavior. And that's very, very difficult. But I plead with you, maintain your poise, maintain your professionalism. Don't allow yourself to become the object of the negative attention. So that's what I would say to that. And of course, we could talk about this for a long time. Okay.
Let's do one more.
Yeah. Let's do one more. Okay. Here's a question. This is a tough one. How do you create safety for xenophobic people to participate? Here's one suggestion, and that is, first of all, you create a diverse team, but whatever you're working on, a project, an initiative, a decision, a course of action, assign certain members of the team to dissent and make it an assignment. Because here's why. Challenging the status quo is already difficult. But if you make it an assignment, you are replacing their personal risk with your institutional permission. And when you do that, you are liberating them and you are allowing them to do what they never thought they could do before. And so when you give them that kind of permission and they're working with others for whom they may have xenophobic thoughts, tendencies, whatever, it accelerates the process of removing that. Now, it's not always successful, but it is a global best practice in my estimation. I've seen it work with astonishing results. So again, assign dissent from the beginning regarding a project or an initiative or a priority that you're working on. Okay, we are at 59 after the hour, so thanks very much for the Q&A. Junior, I'll turn it over to you.
Fantastic. Thanks everybody for your attendance. We really appreciate it. The activity in the chat has been fantastic, really high quality questions and comments. So really appreciate all of you. So a couple things we wanted to mention as we wrap up here. And for those of you who have hung around to the very end, we have some great stuff for you. So there have been several comments in the chat about behavioral examples. What practical recommendations do you have for me and my team? So this is a resource that we've put together for you for free. It's called the 4 Stages of Psychological Safety Behavioral Guide. And there are over 130 specific recommendations to improve each stage of psychological safety. And it gets very tactical. And so this is available to you as a free download. We will send it to you in a post-webinar email. But if you want to get ahead of us, you can go to leaderfactor.com, that link right there, the 4 Stages Behavioral Guide, and you can download that for free. The next thing that we have that we're very excited to announce is the 4 Stages of Psychological Safety Team Survey. So if you've ever wondered what the level of psych safety is in your team or organization, department, etc., this is available to you. We've been working very hard at Leader Factor to be able to produce this. And so it's a 12-item scale based on the 4 stages model where teams can respond and then see results for their psychological safety. It's administered by a manager, and you can get results for all of the 4 stages and go into quite a bit of detail. So I'd also be interested in the chat real quick, if you guys would appreciate a webinar specifically around this team survey, if you'll mention that in the chat. I'm just interested to get a pulse and see if that's something that you guys would be interested in. Okay, it looks like we got some yeses. Okay, excellent, great. So another thing that I'm gonna mention, the first survey for each team at an organization is free. Okay, it's free, costs nothing. So if you go to 4stages.app, register as a user, you can run your own survey for your team and see what the level of psychological safety is. And not only that, we provide recommendations, very practical recommendations for improving each stage. We'll give you your top 3 opportunities and tell you what you can do to improve. And then you can take the survey sequentially to look at your results over time. We recommend quarterly, but we can get into that more later. So last thing, for those of you who have hung around to the bitter end, we've got a giveaway. So we'd like to give away a few copies of the book. We don't even have a slide up for this, so you're just gonna have to listen in. If you go on LinkedIn and tag Leader Factor and mention this webinar and give us your thoughts about it, for the first 10 to 15, depending on how many copies we have available, we'll send you a free digital copy of the book if you haven't had a chance to read it. So once again, if you tag Leader Factor, mention the webinar, give us your thoughts, we'll shoot you a copy of the book to the first 15. All right, everybody, that's
15.
it. Tim, anything else before we wrap it all the way up?
Just appreciate everyone joining. Thanks for being with us.
Yeah, thanks everybody. We'll get this recording over to you. Have a great weekend.